Hey everyone, welcome to our second episode of Antifascist Fridays. This is a show that's about music, art, dancing, sharing stories, coming together to build a culture that's rooted in anti-fascism and resistance that can win and be carried into that better world that we all dream of. We're really excited about this week's show. We've got a guest coming to join us a bit later, Shane Burley, who will talk about the uprising against the federal invasion in Portland. We'll talk about anti-fascist neo-folk music and how to define fascism. So it's going to be an exciting show. Obviously, we're going to play some music too, so why don't we start with that? As always, we're going to share with you in a bit a video that we put together that is, I guess, sort of our love song to all the revolutionaries out there, especially those folks in our beloved city of Portland who are out there in the streets fighting for racial justice, rebelling against police terrorism, who are refusing to back down in the face of the violent war that's being waged against them by both local and federal police. Those who are refusing to go home, refusing to back down and return to the normalcy of systemic white supremacy and police brutality. But first, we've got a performance for you that's from a live stream we did about 2 months ago on the Ablaze en Sus anti-fascist neo-folk page. It's probably the most overtly anti-fascist song that we have at the moment, at least. This first one is called 1,000 Dead Fascists. Let's check it out. 2, 3, 4. That's the wrong song. Ready?
Yeah.
Here we go.
We'll entertain ourselves.
We'll entertain ourselves.
so in love with you. I'm so in love with you. I'm so in love with you. It's always you. This world can be so cold, ruled by greed and cruelty, and we both know what to do. I want to burn it all down with you. I want to burn it all down with you. I want to burn it all down with you. You and only you. When it's dark and cold, and the world is drowning, there is a fire. It's always you. I want to build a new world with you. Build a new world with you. I want to build a new world with you. Only you.
Okay, welcome back. Again, that was a song we just recently published called Revolutionary Love Song. It's our, dedication, our love song to everyone out in the streets right now fighting for a better world. Our comrades, solidarity, stay together, stay tight, be bold, be safe, fight hard. We're with you and we love you. Okay, well, recently we talked with Shane Burley, and we'd like to share that conversation with you. Shane's a journalist who's been in the streets covering the Battle of Portland. He covers the far right and anti fascism. He's an author of an important book called Fascism Today, What It Is and How to End It. And he's the creator of a music review website called A Blaze on Sue's Anti-Fascist Neo-Folk. So we talked with him about what's happening on the ground in Portland, how to define fascism, and about neo-folk music and what spawned this subgenre called anti-fascist neo-folk. So let's see what he had to say.
Hey Shane, welcome to the show.
Well, thanks for having me on.
Well, we hope you're doing well. I know that you've been covering the protests up in Portland, protests, rebellion, uprising, whatever we want to call it. But we certainly hope you're staying safe, as safe as can be in the midst of something like that. What's it been like out there?
Well, it's been both kind of terrifying and I guess exciting too. It's exciting seeing people mobilized in such a kind of united way. People kind of united around militancy and kind of a radical demand. The more conservative elements there are people demanding that they defund the police to a budget of zero. So that's the more conservative side of things. The more radical has like revolutionary ideas about that. So I think all of those. That's a really exciting thing to be around. the flip side of that, though, is it's being inspired by just incredible brutal violence on just a nightly basis.
Yeah.
It's not going anywhere. So on the one hand, there's basically they're called federal officers, but I think people should recognize that they're coming in with automatic weapons dressed in fatigues.
They're soldiers.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely. So like we're talking about federal troops invading a city, having no authority from anyone locally, and just blanket attacking large crowds of people. So yesterday there's 2,000 or more people downtown, a big line of moms and dads, visible. That's why they're there. And they didn't care. I mean, they don't care. They're just shooting munitions into the crowd.
Yeah.
They're blanket attacking people. They've been doing snatch and grab operations. So basically, with protesters that they catch by themselves, they're just snatching and putting them in the vans and driving away, no charges, not even really declaring who they were. You know, what one kid who was picked up that way thought they might have been like militia members, like far right militias, which are around other parts of the state. So like it's really incredibly frightening. Obviously, Trump just announced that he's sending them to other cities: Chicago, Detroit, Albuquerque. So this was sort of people's fear that this was a test ground for him basically invading quote unquote democratic strongholds is actually playing out. So we don't know when this will end. We don't know what it's going to be used for. We don't know what the extent of it's going to be.
Yeah, it is really scary. I mean, you know, the Trump administration is basically invading cities. It certainly seems and feels like an invasion in Portland. It feels like a war, and it's certainly as dangerous as a war. And people have been hurt like in a war. People have gone to the hospital and been shot in the head, been hurt really bad.
Well, and you know, what's weird sitting, I guess, where we are is just having seen this play out over and over and over again with the Portland PD. And them doing the thing they always do, and now it's like getting national attention. Like this isn't new.
Right.
The federal police are new for sure, and so it definitely feels different. But it's like the PPP has been getting away with this for mayor after mayor, at least 3 mayors. So
Let's just say we've been around in Portland.
I mean, that's in a way they started the evolution of this. So I mean, they were incredibly abusive with the protesters and reporters. They were really aggressive with reporters too. And there was a series of injunctions. I think Don't Shoot PDX filed a lawsuit that tampered down the use of CS gas. And there was ACLU lawsuits around the press, particularly around independent journalists, sometimes really young people, no budget, out there reporting on Twitter and stuff. But they're the ones who get the footage that the big networks pick up because they don't have the budgets to send reporters down. So that I think people said that really did show some restraint at that point, but that's when the federal officers came in. So basically the cops were brutalizing people. They got put in their place to not brutalize people. And so they were replaced by people who have no such.
Yeah, right. Oh, and you know, Daryl Turner got on the phone and called someone in the federal government and was like, hey, we can't beat people anymore. Come help us out.
I mean, that's what happened in Chicago. The president of the Fraternal Order of Police basically sent a letter to Trump being like, send in federal officers, and guess what? You know, so it just shows that across the state, federal government, doesn't matter. They're cops and they align with other cops and with Trump.
Right.
Absolutely.
Right. Well, and what's behind all this, and what we're starting to really see coming out more and more are these fascist actions, these fascist activities that we're seeing very up and close in Portland. And I think we should just talk a little bit more about what fascism is, and that's something we know that you've written about. And of course, we're going to fight fascism. And one of the most basic things we need to know is what it is and how to identify it so that we can figure out how to defeat it and end it. So your book, Fascism Today, what it is about and how to end it is all about this. So at the beginning of the book, you talk about a lot of the context behind defining fascism and how defining fascism has to go beyond the structural, how it is an ideology that challenges the left on who has the space to dissent and provide a revolutionary analysis and program about the importance of not defining it in a way that leaves it in the past as some sort of interwar project that isn't relevant to us today. And instead, the need to find a definition that encompasses all of the historical instances of fascism, while also having the space for modern contemporary examples of the fascist movement. You land on what I think might be the most useful definition of fascism that we have in terms of its simplicity and usefulness. You define fascism as inequality through mythological and essentialized identity. And it seems pretty straightforward and simple on the surface, but it's also a definition that seeks to sum up and encompass a number of different threads. So if you could talk to us about this definition and how it is relevant to the growth of fascism we're seeing here in the US and around the world today.
Sure. Yeah. So the goal is to bring together a lot of different movements that don't seem like they have a lot in common. So what do the Nazis have in common with Hindu nationalists right now? Well, the way they structure their party is not the same. The cultures are not the same. The ways that they enforce authority aren't the same. What do they have in common with kind of theocratic Christian far-right people? They're very different at different times and places. And so, for example, one of the things is that contemporary fascist movements, and I mean like the insurrectionary white nationalists, you know, the alt-right stuff, they don't try and replicate old political parties. They think that was like a long kind of lost model. So they're trying to do a new kind of model. We can argue that the GOP maybe is that model incarnate. But the point is that on the one hand, what they have in common is the belief that human beings are unequal, which runs counter to the kind of narrative we have in modern society. We know that people aren't equally treated in society, but there is a narrative that undergirds like all of modern society that people are fundamentally equal at the end of the day. And that fascism is a rebellion against that. And the other thing is that identity are fixed and essentially determine who we are instead of us choosing them. So race is the most common one, but gender and sexual orientation, there's a number of kind of permutations of this. Race is the dominant one, though. That's how we understand it. And then there are things that go along with that that are often there, but not always there. Because you will find these racial nationalists that try and will say that we're never gonna, like, they're anti-statist, you know, or they call themselves anarchists. And so, like, for example, they don't want something that repeats a state, but they want the same structures. They might just do it a different way. Instead of a state, it'll be the church that's authority, or it'll be some other kind of institution. But I think what comes along with that, though, is a lot of these secondary features, which is how we know it. So populism is really important, meaning it's not just, you know, this totalitarian state at the top. It actually requires people participating in it. You know, fascist movements are actually working class movements, and I think it's people are really uncomfortable with that fact, that it actually is like it's people like us. And like you mentioned about the way that it steals dissent from the left, in a lot of ways it has what Robert Paxson, who's a fascism scholar, called the same motivating passions. So crisis, like particularly crisis around inequality, not just economic instability, but the feeling that economic stability is going to happen, or that humiliation is happening in your life, things aren't measuring up. Those sorts of things, when they happen on a mass scale, they theoretically could go to the left, and they can also go to the far right. And so what we're seeing now, particularly, is another one of those kind of secondary features, which is the use of kind of these authoritarian measures to push a kind of right-wing ideology. So Trump, maybe not the most perfect example of fascism, but definitely on the spectrum of the far right. And now in there has the ability of using state powers to do many of the kind of old school fascist things, which like having a paramilitary force, which in this
big one,
and so I think there's a lot of things. You're never going to find the perfect model for how these things work because it's changing with time. But I think we should look at what the predictors are and what the warnings are. And more than that, authoritarianism doesn't need to hit every checkbox to kill people.
A little goes a long way.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Well, and I mean that's what I think is really so useful about the definition that you put forward in the book. Is I guess not just that it's simple, right? I mean, like most definitions, I think, and in a certain sense, rightly so, have like different, multiple points and like layers to the definition. And you know, many of the things that you said, paramilitary and dictatorship and racism, anti-Semitism, et cetera, et cetera. But just the sort of really basic idea of inequality through mythological and essentialized identity. Like you said, it encompasses so much, everything from, like you said, Hindu nationalism to like the Klan and Nazis, and even it even situates like anti-gay marriage movement that almost seems like a thing of the past within like a fascist context, right? Where like these people believe that it's like with gender, gay people are just naturally inferior and shouldn't have the same rights as other people. And I think it really helps bring a lot of things that normally we wouldn't think of as fascism, but really helps bring them into a new light, and part of us as part of a spectrum, like you said, right? You might not be, you know, asking to send people to their deaths, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you're not somewhere positioned on this spectrum of what can exist within fascist ideology.
I think it's hard too because so many of us are raised in like the Christian religion, and you know, God is a fascist. Like God's the biggest fascist. And but we're used to it. Like we accept it. We accept that we have to behave a certain way or we burn forever. Like we just throw that stuff around like it's nothing.
Yeah.
When you break it down, like, and think about it in like this mythological context, I mean, that's huge. I know for me, I think I'm traumatized from that as a kid. So it's like, I think that we're a little bit like blind to it because so many people are raised that way in a church that makes you feel like that ultimate authority over you is absolute and that it's necessary to your eternity. Like, it's huge.
Yeah.
So we're all biased.
Traditions, I mean, it's so funny how like we'll build kind of secular versions of the religions.
It's true.
Like centuries past, you know, like if you think about like contemporary anti-Semitism, and Trump plays this up, is that the anti-Semitism started in the church as a conspiratorial way that's in the scripture, and it was at the pulpit. But now, as a post-Enlightenment world, we just took that and turned it into secular conspiracies. They're exactly the same as they were in the church 1,500 years ago, structurally, but they're ported over to this modern context, you know.
Yeah.
It's just take Jews out of them. It still creates the same kind of model.
Because it works.
Yep. Yeah. Well, and even a lot of you, even when it's not overtly anti-Semitic, you still get a lot of the same tropes that point right back to the anti-Semitism at the base of it.
Absolutely. I mean, the outside agitator is a perfect trope about that. The communities of colors aren't capable of uprising on their own. They have to have these sort of, they're rootless cosmopolitans, whether they're anarchists or just openly called Jews that are coming in and pulling the strings.
Sure. Yep. Yeah. Wow. Well, let's, I guess, move on to the next. We could talk about this all night. We've got to move on at some point because we've got one more question that we want to ask you before we're out of time. So you're, the founder of Ablaze Sue's, the anti-fascist neo-folk music review site. This is one of the big projects that you've been engaged in over the last year or so. For those who don't know, the site reviews neo-folk bands that are anti-fascist, either in their musical and artistic content and or just in their sort of public political positioning, their willingness to speak out against fascism in general and within the music. You've got a Spotify playlist that helps sort of highlight the music and the artists that you interview and write about. This project has really helped create the anti-fascist neo-folk genre. The music might have already been there, of course, or existed prior to the website and the writing. But Ablaze Sue's really helped kind of put a name to it and helped bring artists who are engaging in the work together in one digital space. So if you could just tell us about the music genre called anti-fascist neo-folk, or I guess maybe first, like, what is neo-folk, and then for folks who don't know, and then second, what is anti-fascist neo-folk and why is there a need for that subgenre?
Yeah, so neo-folk is sort of like a romantic revival of folk music, kind of brought together with a whole bunch of other influences. So like metal and industrial, particularly industrial music. So kind of they're post-industrial. So it's kind of a return back to organic sounding instruments and a use of traditional folk. But it's not just playing classic folk. It's actually kind of totally reimagining it. Mm-hmm. And there's a real kind of beautiful synthesis of it. There's like kind of a romantic desire to look back to nature or back to old traditions and old ways that have been lost, folkways. All of this was done by I wouldn't say most, but the most prominent neo-folk artists because they were far-right people who wanted to romanticize a kind of monolithic pre-Christian Europe and kind of tell a mythic story about who they were in their past. And they were an influential piece of rebranding the far right in Europe and in the US to a degree as something that was cultural and artistic, not just like boots and braces and attacking people in the street and that kind of thing. And it's part of like the same kind of impulse about reclaiming Nordic pagan traditions, right? Or the same thing, I guess, to a degree with Celtic traditions and things like that. And so But at the same time, we're talking about music that evolves and changes the second someone kind of unleashes, and people create their own similar genres or parallel genres or influence, but don't have those politics, or more and more actually ran directly counter to those politics. And it really opens to the fact that romantic art is actually one that has a long left and revolutionary and anti-racist tradition too, or people who also want to look to the past, but not through some kind of just rose-colored lens, but to see things that they can bring into the future, or to look forward with a utopian vision, which I think is really, we should acknowledge as the kind of core of a revolutionary movement. And so, so there are artists of these genres that don't come from that. There's also non-white artists. There's artists from all around the world that are bringing in folk traditions that aren't just centered on Western Europe. And so that Western European neo-folk far-right connection does not transmute all across the world. And so those people should be a part of the conversation. And then we're also talking about the inclusion of traditional folk structures that were always anti-capitalist or and anti-fascist, like klezmer, Jewish folk music, and Irish anti-imperialist music and stuff like that. So there was like a whole influx of those sorts of things. For me personally, I like neo-folk a lot, and I wanted an actual space for it because that didn't exist. There was bands here and there, but there was no space for it. If I was to go to like a neo-folk festival, I would do this all the time. I'd look at the, oh, there's some great festival in Europe, and you look at it, and I'm like, I can already tell you that National Front's going to be there. What these things are. I got a press release tossed over to me today about a band I used to just love on Prophecy Records, and their new album release says that this new album is named Deus Vult so that they can quote unquote protect Western civilization from invaders. This is that there's like a mainline culture of that anti-fascism, but people have become so conscious that they want to have that culture themselves. And the second I kind of made a blog or asked people to do interviews, it wasn't like a few bands came over. It was hundreds.
That doesn't surprise me.
There's so many that I can't keep up with it. And I just got, for example, contact with a record label 3 days ago that's like, hey, we're doing these anti-fascist neo-folk compilations. We have 60 artists on this. We're talking about just huge.
Wow.
So I think that when you create the space for it, people kind of know that is actually possible. And more than that, it actually takes that thing, I think that artistic impulse in saying that those romantic kind of artistic inspirations, those are not right-wing ones. They're not naturally owed to that, and there's no reason that they actually have to have access to people and people's emotions in that way. And so I think that we're actually creating that counter space for it to develop. And my hope is that over time, that will become a natural evolution, and it won't just be one that's agitational about us finding that will be a piece of it, but it'll be one that's just natural, where people will start doing these bands and they'll naturally be coming up from the left in an anti-racist position.
Yeah,
that's the hope.
That would be awesome. Well, we're about out of time, but I really want to ask one quick follow-up question. You mentioned sort of the importance of non-white, non-European American, non-Western neo-folk bands being part of this sort of subgenre of anti-fascist neo-folk, and especially here in the West, I think we so often just assume like white European music when we think of folk music. I mean, maybe that's because that's our folk music as white people, but
world music.
Right, yeah. But so I'm just curious, what are maybe like one or two of the bands that you have come across that you would consider anti-fascist neo-folk that aren't rooted in this sort of Western European folk music?
Let me actually talk in broad brush a little bit. So the biggest kind of influx that I've gotten is from South America. Argentina, Chile, there's been Paraguayan bands that have come in. There's a lot of these that are using kind of indigenous folk music as a part of this. Mm-hmm. There's been a number of Chinese or neo-folk bands that I haven't been able to connect with. They're creating a lot of that music, and klezmer neo-folk bands in Eastern Europe. And so there's actually a really kind of huge influx of that. Also, to give credit to some of the kind of, Western European bands, there's been an effort to kind of bring back particular, kind of non-traditional folk music. So like Galician folk music and regional Catalonian folk music.
Yeah.
Music was always part of like a kind of suppressed culture. It's in the same way that like Irish folk music came back at the earlier parts of the century as kind of a resistance to the homogeneity of imperial Britain, and the same thing is sort of happening in Spain. The same thing is sort of happening in like southern France and stuff like that. So a lot of those places are doing that. And then again, there is a lot in South Asia. There's intermixing, for example, like Kashmir music as neofolk. A lot of it's also coming out of the black metal world, where it was easier to kind of mix genres. And so I think there's a lot of overlap there.
Wow. Well, that's really fascinating. I'd love to talk with you more sometime off the camera about all of that stuff that's going on in the rest of the world, music-wise. It's just really interesting to me. That's all. Yeah. But we are out of time. So we really want to thank you for joining us here on our second episode of Anti-Fascist Fridays. And want to thank you for all the great work that you do, all the great writing that you do, the great journalism. It's really important to the community and the movement. And we really appreciate it.
We really appreciate it. We know you work really hard, and we definitely appreciate it for sure.
Well, absolutely. I really appreciate kind words like that.
Have a good one.
Bye, Shane. Take care.
Bye.
Well, we hope you enjoyed the show, everyone. Thanks for joining us for another episode of Anti-Fascist Fridays, and we'll see you next time.